Hello friends, welcome to Read With Me. Today we are continuing our Mr. Putter and Tabby book series with Mr. Putter and Tabby Take the Train. The author is Cynthia Rylant. The author writes the wonderful words. The illustrator is Arthur Howard. The illustrator creates the pretty pictures. Now if we look at the cover, we see Mr. Putter sitting here thinking about a train. I wonder if he is wanting to take a train trip. Let's find out. Chapter 1, An Idea. It looks like Mr. Putter is talking on the phone. One day, Mr. Putter and his fine cat Tabby were cooking some oatmeal when Mrs. Teaberry called. I think Tabby likes oatmeal. She's really watching. Mrs. Teaberry was Mr. Putter's friend and neighbor. "I have an idea," she told Mr. Putter. As she spoke, her good dog, Zeke, wagged at Tabby through the window. Tabby and Zeke were friends and neighbors too. Look, Zeke is standing in the sink wagging his tail at Tabby. How cute. Mr. Putter was not sure he wanted to hear Mrs. Teaberry's idea. Sometimes her ideas were odd and involved running fast, or wearing feathers, or having purple toes. I think they're smashing grapes. But Mr. Putter always had good manners, so he asked, "What is your idea, Mrs. Teaberry?" Though he really didn't want to know. "I think we should take a train," said Mrs. Teaberry. A train? Thought Mr. Putter. Mr. Putter loved trains. When he was a boy, he rode them all the time. He loved the big windows and smooth seats and traveling backwards. But he hadn't been on a train in years. Have you ever been on a train? Trains are pretty fun to ride on. "I haven't been on a train in years," he told Mrs. Teaberry. "Exactly," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Let's go tomorrow. We'll go north for 2 hours, then turn around and come back." Mr. Putter looked at Tabby, who was still waiting for her oatmeal. "Can we bring Tabby and Zeke?" Mr. Putter asked Mrs. Teaberry. Mr. Putter likes to take Tabby everywhere he goes. "Of course," she said. "You're sure pets are allowed?" he asked. "Certainly. And they can sit with us on the train?" Mr. Putter asked. "Of course they can," said Mrs. Teaberry. "You're sure?" said Mr. Putter. "I'm sure," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Positive?" asked Mr. Putter. "Positive," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Pets," she declared, "can go on trains." I think Zeke heard the word go. He has his leash. He is ready. Chapter 2, Another Idea. "I'm sorry," said the ticket woman the next day. "Pets can't go on trains." Oh no, what are they going to do? "What?" said Mrs. Teaberry. She's shocked. She was certain that pets were allowed. Zeke was standing beside her, wearing his traveling jacket. It had lots of pockets for bones and balls and little doggy lollipops. Look, Zeke is ready to go. Mr. Putter and Tabby stood beside Zeke. They didn't have traveling jackets, just a nice blue blanket for naps. Mr. Putter looked at Mrs. Teaberry. "You said positive," he told her. "Well, the last time I took a train, pets were allowed," said Mrs. Teaberry. "When was that?" asked Mr. Putter. 1938, said Mrs. Teaberry. That was a very long time ago. Mr. Putter had to smile. "Let's just go home," he said. "We'll have some tea." "We can't go home," said Mrs. Teaberry. "I've brought cards and games and binoculars and banana crunchies, and Zeke's jacket is all filled up." "Did you say banana crunchies?" asked Mr. Putter. Mrs. Teaberry nodded. "Like the kind we have on the 4th of July?" asked Mr. Putter. Mrs. Teaberry nodded again. Suddenly, Mr. Putter couldn't imagine anything nicer than being on a train with Tabby and Mrs. Teaberry and Zeke eating banana crunchies. It would be the best train ride of his life. "We're not getting any younger," Mr. Putter told Mrs. Teaberry. "I have another idea." I wonder what other idea Mr. Putter came up with. Chapter 3, Taking the Train. Mr. Putter and Mrs. Teaberry went home. 1 hour later, they went back to the station and bought their tickets. But where are Tabby and Zeke? I think I have an idea. I see a black nose and a doggy lollipop. Do you think Zeke is on Mr. Putter's back? Mr. Putter looked a little different this time. He had a very lumpy pack on his back. It was full of little holes, and sometimes tiny doggy lollipops fell out. Mr. Putter just stuck the lollipops back in and patted the pack on its head. Mrs. Teaberry looked a little different too. She was wearing a smock with very big pockets full of cards and games and binoculars and banana crunchies. And she carried a picnic basket that purred, but no one could hear it except Mrs. Teaberry. "Look, Tabby's in the basket. They're smuggling them in." The two old friends got on the train and found seats by a big window. The train began to roll. Chug, chug, chug. Mr. Putter was so happy he thought he would burst. And for the next 4 hours, he and Mrs. Teaberry had the train ride of their lives. Of course, the backpack decided to crawl under the seat and snore. Look at Zeke snoring. And the picnic basket kept batting at the window shade. Look, you can see Tabby's paw. But Mr. Putter and Mrs. Teaberry just petted them fondly and fed them banana crunchies the whole way. Let's review. Characters are people or animals in a story. So who were the characters in this story? That's right, Mr. Putter and Tabby, Mrs. Teaberry and her good dog Zeke, and the ticket woman. And how did Mr. Putter and Mrs. Teaberry get Zeke and Tabby on the train? That's right, they smuggled them in. Zeke was a backpack and Tabby was in a picnic basket. Thank you for watching. Please consider liking this video and subscribing. If you've already done that, thank you so much. Until next time.